My name is Josefina Syssner. I'm Associate Professor at the Center for Local Government Studies at Linköping University. And my presentation and my research also that I do together with colleagues deals with local development, local policy and local planning beyond the urban growth areas. And during the last 5 to 10 years, I've dealt mostly with those areas that undergo demographic decline, that do shrink in terms of population. And the data I use and the methods I use are qualitative methods. I do interviews with local government representatives. I study text and talk and do observations. So that is, so to say, the data that I have. You can change the slide. And these are just to show some of the work that I've done together with colleagues, and the publication that might be the most relevant one here is the up to the right corner from Springer that came last year. It is called Pathways to Demographic Adaptation, and it deals with how to cope with the demographic decline. So you can change the slide. What I will do here today is say that I will sort of present 3 arguments, and I think most of them are very sort of known by most of you who listen here today. But I think it's for the sake of clarity, I think it's good to bring them anyway. The first statement or argument that I would like to make is that demographic decline is still a fact in many rural areas. I think many of us have heard during the last year that COVID has changed this, and that urbanization has ceased to exist, and that the problem is solved now for the rural areas. So I think also the maps that we saw in the previous session also strengthens this argument. The second argument I have is that demographic decline has vital consequences for local municipalities and for communities, and therefore we still need to address that issue, even if we find that the post-pandemic state changes the conditions somehow. And the last argument I have that I hope that we have time to discuss always also is that I think that local governments, they do need to develop policies for how to cope both with demographic decline, but also perhaps with the post or pandemic order and with the issue of multi-locality that the speakers before me spoke about. So you can change the slide. But what I would like to say first to those who attend today who are not maybe active in research themselves, but maybe active more in politics or in planning or as practitioners. I think I think we should try to understand what research could contribute with to society. And one option is, of course, that we continue to come with new responses to old questions. But one thing that I think is even more important is that we actually have the courage and the possibility as researchers to bring up new questions and to respond to them. And you can change the slide. And I think a very classical question in many fields of research is how growth can be promoted in those areas that do not grow. This is, I would say, the standard questions that has followed at least me during my research career. But if you change the slide, I would say that another question that is increasingly raised by colleagues all over Europe and all over the globe is how the absence of growth could be managed by local governments, because it's not really realistic to believe that all places will grow always. So we need not only to develop policies for how to even out growth or how to balance that, but also how to handle the absence of growth. So then you can change the slide again. So again, then, my first argument is that we do still face demographic decline, and we do face that in many rural areas. Quite often when we talk about this, people who are sort of are keen to forefront the pros and the advantages of rural areas find this a bit disturbing. I think it's important to say that we have rural areas that grow. We have rural areas in proximity to urban areas that are actually experience an inflow of inhabitants during the pandemic, but for great parts of at least rural Sweden, demographic decline is still a fact. You can change the slide then. If we, and I really thank you for the excellent maps that you showed in the previous session. It shows that almost half of the 290 municipalities in Sweden do experience long-term demographic decline if we look back to the mid-70s and onwards. I have no map on this, but I just counted quickly the other day, and it's easy to establish that at least almost a third or a bit more than a third of the municipalities in Sweden have less inhabitants today than they had before the pandemic. And those 97 municipalities are not the rural, the regional centers or urban areas. The majority of those municipalities that still shrink have previous experience of demographic decline, and I think that's important to address. Next argument then is that we need to be aware that demographic decline really has vital consequences, and I think that's important to raise. Can change the slide. Just to put it very quickly, depopulation, since the Swedish tax system is so closely connected to population figures, depopulation has severe consequences for the welfare sector, for school, for elder care, for social services, for public finances, for the local governments. It also has consequences for the labor market, for the ability to attract workforce. It also has consequences for social and cultural life. So all sectors, I would say, of public life, but also of the community is affected by an aging and shrinking population. And I think it's important that we keep this in mind, and that we do not say that the problem is over just because some particular spots do grow, maybe as a consequence of distance work and so forth. When we make interviews with those local governments, they tell us stories about constant savings, that they have hard times meeting the standards in the welfare sectors set by the central state. In Sweden, we also have the municipalities have the right to set the tax rates themselves, and quite constantly the small shrinking rural municipalities have higher tax rates than we have in the urban growth areas. So citizens in those places do not only get maybe lower access to welfare, they also pay more for it. The next slide. When we talk about with politicians about these issues, many of them articulate a constant hope for growth, for reversing the trend. This is a constant hope, I would say, in the municipal sector, to be able to change the trend of urbanization and to reverse depopulation and decline into growth. And this is massive to the extent that some of the persons that we interview even deny the fact that they actually do shrink, because they have other ideas of what is actually going on. We do see that most of the local governments we meet, they do take the decisions to adapt their organization and their services to a changing demography, to a smaller population and to an elder population. But we see that they have problems to do that in a strategic manner. Many of those quite troublesome and hard decisions are taken very late. And many of the politicians that we interview say that they have hard times getting the right the information they need for taking the right decisions. And that is also due to the fact that the local administration in those places is quite small, and also not really. They have to be generalist, and they do not have the resources to make good investigations. We also see that those politicians that we interview are they find it quite hard to communicate depopulation and the consequences thereof to the citizens. And many of them say to us in interviews that you do not win any elections of communicating the fact that we are shrinking and that we have to make savings accordingly. So the next slide then. So the third argument I would like to make here is that local governments, they do need to develop policies for how to cope with the demographic decline, with the fact that they get the population declines, shrinks, and that the population also gets older. But I would also add, and this is something that has come up now, of course, during the last 1.5 years, I think that we should also try to pay an interest, all of us as researchers, in how local governments cope not only with the demographic decline, but also with these conditions that the current situation come with. So you can change the slide. When we ask local politicians what they do as a result of population decline, the response that we constantly get is we try to reverse decline into growth. So this is the sort of the policy theory that they present us with. They talk about measures such as branding, support to entrepreneurialism, support to business climate, and so forth. And with that, they aim at supporting growth, employment, and also incoming population investments. And of course, with this, they want this to result in a growing economy and better conditions for both public finances, public sector, but also for the private sector. So when we ask what do you do as a consequence of population decline, this is the answer. But what we've asked for, me and my colleagues, for many years, and now you can change the slide, is this: how can you manage, and what kind of policies can you develop in order to manage with absence of growth? And the suggestion that we forwarded, me and my colleagues, in many contexts before, this sounds like an old Schlager anthem almost now, is that those local governments, they need also to develop adaptation policies. And these measures are completely different. It could be about efficiency, but it could also be about intermunicipal collaboration. It could be about innovation. It could be about collaboration with the civil society. And these measures aim at adapting the local government organization and services to current demographic conditions. And of course, the result that they should go for is an economy in balance and retained and still a good quality. But what we would like to add now, I think, and what we need to raise is, now we can change the slide, is maybe we need something else. Maybe we need to look for something else at the local level of government. Maybe we need to ask how depopulating areas, because I think these are the ones who might benefit the most from increased multilocality. What kind of strategies, what kind of policies can they develop in order to benefit from the situation that we have right now? And you already, colleagues who presented before me, they already raised many very interesting issues that align with this. It deals with how can those digital nomads, temporary inhabitants, second home owners, tourists, guest workers, newly arrived immigrants, etc., how can they be treated as resources in the best way possible, even if they do not settle, even if they do not become taxpayers in the municipality? And I think that if we just use our fantasy, this is not, we have no data on this yet, but if we just use our imagination, it could be this localization policy could, of course, be about providing broadband, providing services also for temporal visitors, of course, meeting the demands of those who are in the municipality on a short-term basis. But it could also be about using those temporary inhabitants as resources when it comes to work, when it comes to networks, when it comes to competence, and when it comes to building a resilient and a livable community. I think those temporary inhabitants shouldn't be seen only as customers or as persons who ask for service. They could also be addressed as people who actually would like to build a society at the place where they stay parts of the year. And I think it's also vital that, and I think all of us have that perspective. We know that digitalization do solve things, but in order for a place to be livable, for a community to exist, there also have to be some place-based activities and qualities. And I think those kind of localization policies need to address these issues too. So looking at the watch, you can my last slide then. I think what I would like to raise, maybe here, but also in the future, is how policies for growth, classical growth policy, how policies for demographic adaptation and for localization, how could they be designed and how could they also be integrated with each other? Because they shouldn't replace each other, they shouldn't compete with each other, but I think in the best case possibly, they should be integrated with each other and support each other. So thank you. I think my time ran out with that, so I'm happy to leave over to the next speaker.